Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on 2024 state climate policy trends. We will get started in just a moment as folks trickle in. But feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're calling in from. And yeah, we'll get started in just a minute or so. Alrighty, so as folks are trickling in, and let me know if the audio is still echoing. As folks are trickling in, feel free to enable live transcription at the bottom of your screen under captions. And yeah, go ahead and keep introducing yourself in the chat. I will get started with a little bit of an introduction, but welcome everyone to our February deep dive webinar on 2024 state climate policy trends. We can go ahead and get started with a little bit of an introduction. On the next slide, you can see my name is Kristen, my pronouns are she, they, and I am the State Climate Policy Network Manager here at Climate Exchange. You can learn more about the SCPN's programming, research, all of the sorts of things that we do at climate-exchange.org/network, which I just sent in the chat. On the next slide, in case it's your first time joining us, Climate Exchange is a national organization focused on passing effective and equitable climate policy at the state level. And the SCPN is one of our national programs, how we do that to support state work. We're a network of over 15,000 advocates, policymakers, researchers, students, basically all sorts of folks working in and around state level climate policy across all 50 states. And if this is your first time engaging with the SCPN or you want to learn more about the network, I just sent that link in the chat. It'll lead you to recordings and recap articles of past events, and as well as upcoming events, including our monthly national update call, which will be happening in 2 weeks, where folks will be calling in, just giving updates on the state climate policy developments in their state. Through these sorts of events, we really hope to create a space for network members to connect on climate policy and really learn from the vast knowledge and experience already held within the network of state actors across the country. Please feel free to reach out to me if you are interested in connecting it with anyone, any of the speakers or anyone else on this call, Kristen at climate-exchange.org. And yeah, on the next slide, a couple ways we can support you or your work, or we can connect you to someone who can. And again, feel free to email me if you're interested in any of this. Climate Exchange specializes in tracking and analyzing state climate policy. We can provide example states for climate policies. We can provide state landscape analyses. Much of this is fueled by our state climate policy dashboard, where we track over 65 types of enacted state level climate policy across all 50 states. And then I always say, someone somewhere is doing what you're trying to do. If we can't help you, we can connect you to someone who can. So feel free to let us know what your campaign is about and if you need some support. And then last slide, just to wrap up our introduction here. If you are a supporter of your work, consider buying a ticket for yourself or as a gift for a loved one for our EV raffle, carbonraffle.org. Ticket sales end February 27th. The grand prize winner gets their pick of a fully customized EV from any manufacturer. And then we have cash prizes for 2nd through 5th place from $10,000 to $2,000. And this fundraiser helps maintain our policy dashboard and SCPN programming like this, all at no cost to you all. And we will get into our presentations. So today we've invited an amazing panel of speakers. You can see on the next slide, they will be talking about what state needs to know about 2024 climate policy trends, including federal climate funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And right before I get into the introduction of our speakers, just a logistical note, feel free to use the chat box, as everyone has been, as a space for connection, sharing resources, drop your contact information if you'd like to connect with anyone. But if you do have any topic-related questions for the panelists, please submit those at any time through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you submit those through the regular chat, they might get lost. But if you submit them through Q&A, we might be able to respond to them at the end of the event. And also this webinar is being recorded, so if you have to hop off at any point or you know someone who wanted to make it but couldn't, we'll be sharing the recording and slides via email, as well as a summary recap article by the end of the week. So we have 3 amazing speakers. We are going to get more into their introductions before each of these presentations, and then we'll have Q&A to wrap it up at the end, but we'll have Ava Gallo from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators to give us an overview of state climate policy trends, what's happening in state legislatures across the country, and then we'll hand it over to Jaclyn Lea and Tom Taylor from Atlas Public Policy to give us the scoop on federal climate funding. So if we go to the next slide, Ava Gallo, our first speaker, serves as NCEL's Climate and Energy Program Manager, where she works to support legislators across the country on every policy topic under the climate and clean energy umbrella. And before her time at NCEL, Ava continued her passion for environmental policy and advocacy at the state level at Climate Exchange, actually, as well as the Environmental Voter Project and Conservation Law Foundation. So I will hand it over to you, Ava. We can go to the next slide to start your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Really always a lovely opportunity to come back and speak on a climate exchange webinar. As Kristen said, my name is Ava Gallo, and I am with NCEL, and I'm going to be talking about the trends that we're seeing across the climate and energy policy spectrum in legislatures for the 2024 session. But just to kick us off, I'm going to chat a little bit more about who NCEL is, so you know the background that I'm going to be coming from. So on the next slide, you can see that we are a nationwide network of over 1,200 legislators in all 50 states and both major parties. And so we're nonpartisan, non-lobby. We really just work at this connection point for legislators to learn from each other and learn about some complex policy ideas. And so we are created by and for state legislators. We have opportunities to meet virtually, in person, do personalized research for state legislators, and provide bill tracking and materials on best practice legislation. And so on the next slide, you can see that I'm representing today the Climate and Energy Program, but we also have conservation, environmental health, and oceans as well. So really covering everything in the environmental policy space. So on the next slide, you can see a little bit more about how we do our bill tracking. That's publicly available on our website. And I will go ahead and link that in the chat. But I'm going to make sure that it sends to everyone, not just the panelists. And so this is where a lot of the information that will be on my slides today, you can find on our website, and even more than what's on my slides today as well. You can filter through with these different issue areas linked here. You can filter through, see if the bill has been enacted. Then you can see kind of who the sponsors are, where it is in the bill passing process. And anything that might be helpful to your cause. So you can see on our website, we have several different issue areas that might help you narrow it down a little bit more. But with that, I'm going to start the presentation on the policies and kick us off with emerging technologies on the next slide. And so we've really seen the conversation pivot a little bit. We've been talking about run-of-the-mill solar and wind for a while now. And I think that states are really trying to lean in to some of these more emerging technologies that are more complex, just starting to hit the market and become salient as a resource, and especially spurred on by some federal funding opportunities that our folks will talk about in the next presentation. But you can see in the next slide that we see several different states introducing legislation on geothermal. This example of what our maps would look like on the website, but you can see it's a pretty wide swath of states that have introduced legislation on geothermal so far. Generally limited to more progressive blue states on climate policy, but I think that you'll see in the past that states like in the Southwest, like Colorado, have been leading the charge on geothermal in the past couple of years, but definitely starting to come more to the forefront, especially with the common criticism about renewable energy being intermittent and what will be the dispatchable resource. And geothermal is a pretty good candidate for that as well. And so definitely keep your eye on how geothermal legislation and incentives and building up sort of the regulatory structure around that energy resource will continue in the next couple of years, especially this session. In the next slide, you'll see states looking to incentivize energy storage. Similar states, but you could see very concentrated in that West Coast line of states there. I think energy storage is another aspect that has come to address what will the dispatchable resource be. And I think energy storage has become more and more cost competitive as the years have gone on, and states are trying to see how they can incentivize energy storage and make it kind of on parity with some of the regulatory structures that don't necessarily account for this type of resource in the market. So energy storage is going to be really key in terms of harnessing the resources that we need when the sun isn't shining, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can see you could see on our website all of these specific bills that are in each of these states that have been introduced, but just to give you a span of what is happening across the country right now. On the next slide, I think that we've seen the trend of agrivoltaics and community solar start to really come to the forefront as it has in the past couple of years as well. This goes hand in hand with just thinking through, well, we know we need a lot of solar, but where can we put it? And I think there's been a lot of tension that we've all seen in the news around wanting to protect agricultural lands and needing land for solar. And I think that states have been really cognizant of how can work together in collaboration to ensure that farmers who need extra revenue are able to access that opportunity, but at the same time protecting agricultural lands in areas that might desperately need them. And so there've been some interesting pieces of legislation here. And we also have a resource from on our website from some agrivoltaics policy that have already been passed in other states that I can link after this, or maybe my colleague Sidra on the call can link it in the chat for me. And also community solar, I think in the past couple of years, but particularly with the passage of the IRA and with the Solar for All funding grant program, which I'm sure we'll talk more about later, states have really been eager to build out more robust community solar programs. So these are a couple examples of legislation. And that's a couple examples, but there certainly are more that we are tracking as well. But just to highlight a couple of there that have been introduced across different states. And then moving away from emerging technologies and onto the grid, you can see that there's several different aspects of the grid work that go to the next slide. Thanks. Several different aspects of the grid that folks are starting to consider more strongly. I think it has certainly come to the forefront that that the grid is an instrumental piece of the puzzle. And if we, it doesn't matter how many incentives that there are for solar or renewable energy, if you can't get those resources connected to the grid, or you can't build a grid that is bringing where the energy is to where people use energy, which is not often in the same spot. So grid policy, which can be certainly very wonky and difficult to understand, has really started to proliferate across the legislatures this year. And so in the next slide, talk about grid enhancing technologies, or as some folks might call them, GETs, just to keep up with the trendy nicknames. And this kind of gets at the concept of, I'm sure we've all heard a lot about, we rapidly need to develop more transmission lines in order to maximize the benefits of the IRA, but transmission lines can take decades to permit and build and come to completion. And so to answer this question, how can we increase the capacity of the grid without waiting decades right now for new lines? The answer has proven to be grid enhancing technologies, which essentially expand the capacity of the lines that are already there, so that they can accommodate more energy and without building a whole new line. So that can include things like dynamic line ratings, advanced reconductoring, which all are very complex sounding terms. And I can put something in the chat about grid enhancing grid enhancing technologies, but essentially you can think of them like energy efficiency for transmission. So what are kind of these things that can allow us to not have to continue to build new infrastructure, but maximize the infrastructure that we already have. Yes, so there's a couple states who have introduced legislation on this session. So in Massachusetts, Virginia, New York, and Utah, which is a nice little combination of states there. And the Virginia bill has already passed their House. That session moves very quickly. So if you're looking for bills that have already passed one chamber, a lot of them will already be in Virginia. But essentially, they looking at requiring utilities to analyze grid enhancing technologies as they plan out transmission. So instead of just saying, oh, well, we need a new line, this legislation would require utilities to analyze the cost benefit analysis of instead using grid enhancing technologies, and also allowing utilities to have some cost recovery and incentives for the grid enhancing technologies, because currently there isn't a good structure for that. So it'll be interesting to see how these bills move. I know states are really eager to do work on transmission, but a lot of that power resides in the federal government, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, are working on it. But as we know, the federal government is not the fastest of vehicles. So states are acting in this way in the meantime. And then on the next slide, another big policy topic on the grid is looking at microgrids and virtual power plants. So essentially looking at how you can protect communities if there's a disaster and energy goes off the grid. How can you insulate communities so that they can be more responsive and resilient if the power goes out? And also allow having technology that can regulate a grid on a smaller scale. So including things like smart meters that can kind of regulate a community's power, pushing and pulling the energy as needed depending on the capacity of the grid. So that's a really important lever as well. Again, another kind of complex, wonky one, but we've seen that in a lot of different states. These are a couple of highlights here. A lot of these grid policies often have the ability to be bipartisan as well. And so you see legislation introduced in New Hampshire that maybe they might be able to push on grid policy when they wouldn't be able to push on some other climate legislation. So a couple examples here as well. And I know lots of links and bill numbers, so we'll definitely be sharing this presentation at the end as well. But just giving a highlight now, and then moving along to utility policy. I think what we've been trying to educate our legislators is about how utility policy is climate policy, and how so much of how utility rate making and structure is at the moment is really hampering our ability to act on climate, regardless of what the legislature does. So it's really important to think about how we can change these structures. So looking forward on the next couple of slides on performance-based rate making, just 2 more slides ahead. Great. Okay. So performance-based rate making attempts to try and change the way that utilities are rewarded for their activities. So right now, utilities get a return on investment when they build a power plant or a new transmission line or something like that. And what we want to incentivize our utilities to do are reduce the energy that folks consume through energy efficiency. We want them to incentivize distributed energy. We want to reward utilities that are more resilient to disasters, things like that. And the current system of how utilities make their money as a for-profit organization doesn't necessarily incentivize that. So this concept of performance-based rate making, or you might hear it as PBR, attempts to switch what utilities are incentivized to do. So this has already been highlighted or passed and introduced, and states are working through some of this right now. Connecticut has passed legislation on it, Hawaii, some other states, which is in our utility briefing book. But these are the states that are looking at it for this session. You can see, again, we have New Hampshire, and Maryland and Virginia. So lots going on in Virginia and Maryland this session. They've already been on a couple of slides. So exciting work there. And then the next thing about utilities that I'll say is on the next slide, looking at utility accountability. This might be a trend that you've heard about in the past year as well. And so this idea of prohibiting utilities from recovering the costs that they pay to trade associations or to lobby government officials against climate policies. So really thinking about why should utilities be able to charge their ratepayers for lobbying that they are doing basically against our interests as consumers. So this is an attempt to not allow utilities to do that. And last year, Connecticut, Colorado, and Maine all passed legislation on this. This year, we see Virginia, Illinois, Maryland, and California already introducing legislation to varying degrees on this topic as well. And we might see some more states on this as the session continues. But again, Virginia and Maryland on every slide here, doing great work. Great. Okay, so on the next slide, just going to briefly touch on one aspect of building decarbonization, which are heat pumps. So on the next slide, this is through legislation. As you can see, a couple states down here have introduced legislation on some heat pump tax credits, looking at how they can incentivize their utility commission to install heat pumps, things of that nature. But also in a really exciting update, last week, 9 states set a new goal of achieving 65% market penetration for heat pumps by 2030 and 90% by 2040. And they're creating this kind of compact to work together to advance those goals. So that's really exciting. It's a pretty wide swath of states there who are working on advancing heat pumps. Maine has already been the leader in this so far, which if anyone ever tells you that cold states can't have heat pumps, just tell them that Maine has the highest amount of heat pumps in the country of any state. So Maine has really led the charge. So it's great that they're part of this network and are helping to lead the other states along with them. I know I'm getting a lot of chats, but I will look at the end so that we can move through. On the next slide, transportation, have a couple of things to cover here. So on the next slide, looking at DOT reform or incentivizing or requiring Department of Transportation to consider the greenhouse gas emission and vehicle miles travel impacts of their transportation projects. So essentially, a big conversation since the passage of the infrastructure bill has been, there was a lot of funding in there that states could just pump into highways. They have the flexibility to not do that, but I think state departments of transportations, I've heard from many folks, can sometimes be out of line with the legislatures on their climate goals. And so this effort seeks to create restrictions or sets a cap on how many vehicle miles traveled that DOT can kind of create new based off new projects, like creating new highways or widening highways, things like that. So it sets a cap on that. And if our project is going to increase vehicle miles traveled, then they have to mitigate that increase by investing in other projects like improving public transit, creating bike infrastructure, expanding remote work options, et cetera, et cetera. So it really tries to shift that narrative of investing more money in these other opportunities instead. And so in Colorado passed this legislation in 2021, Minnesota passed it last session, and this session we're seeing both New York and Maryland consider this legislation as well, which is really exciting way to focus more on how you can incentivize transportation that is clean other than just electric vehicles, because we need to reduce vehicle miles travel by 20%, regardless of how many electric vehicles we have on the road in order to meet our climate goals. So incentivizing transit, bike ped infrastructure is really critical as well. And then on the last slide, we'll talk about paying for transportation. And there are a lot of kind of thoughts here. I know that there's still a lot of funding in both infrastructure bill and IRA for transportation, but I know folks are starting to look ahead for what's going to happen as the gas tax money decreases over time as folks transition into electric vehicles, and also what are we going to do with how are we going to pay for these new bike ped projects for public transit as some of this federal funding runs out. And so in Colorado and Minnesota, they have passed these kind of concepts of rideshare and retail delivery fees, which charges a small fee on all kind of Uber, Lyft rides, and then also any e-delivery. So if you get a package from Amazon, small fee on that goes back into investing in public transit. So we've seen several different states introduce legislation on that already this session. And some other states have been introducing legislation on creating a road user fee or an electric vehicle fee, which I think can be a good or a bad policy, depending. You don't want to disincentivize electric vehicles by, charging a really crazy fee. That makes it inequitable for folks who are driving EVs compared to gas powered vehicles. But also, there needs to be a solution for replacing the gas tax. And so depending on how folks can balance that could be a good or a bad policy. But I think that having the rideshare and retail delivery fees has proven really successful. Colorado has already had this for a couple of years, and it's created a very large pot of funding for their public transit and electric vehicle transition. So lots of information, I know, and I tend to talk fast, but I think we're doing questions at the end, right? So I will leave it there. And then if folks want to ask questions in the chat, if you go to the 2 slides ahead, you can see my contact information there. And let me know if you have any further questions about anything I presented on or anything on our website. Happy to connect further. But very exciting to see all the states acting on so many different policies this year. And I'm eager to see what can get passed this year. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ava. I cannot believe you were able to get through so many different things and it all made so much sense. So kudos to you. We will go along to our next presentation. On the next slide, we have Jaclyn Lea and Tom Taylor from Atlas Public Policy to talk about federal climate funding today. Jaclyn Lea is a policy associate at Atlas Public Policy, where she supports original research and analyses on electric transportation, building decarb, and other areas of climate policy. Tom is a senior policy analyst and brings together data, policy, and communications at Atlas. Both of them work on the climate program portal, which they will get into in just a moment. But yeah, they'll be talking about federal climate funding updates and milestones and things like that today. I'll hand it over to you, Tom, and we can go to the next slide.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, nice. I will start by just putting this link in the chat. Cool. Thank you so much for having us. First of all, a caveat or promise, we will not get through as much information as Ava. That was a formidable amount of information to get through in such a short presentation. So kudos, Ava. We will do our best to keep you entertained, but we promise we will not be winning the gold medal today. So I'm going to get us started to talk a little bit about the climate program portal that Jaclyn and I are very involved in, and hopefully you get some emails from Jaclyn every now and then. So if you go to the next slide, very briefly, the climate program portal is built by Atlas Public Policy, where Jaclyn and I work, and we there's a bunch of words on this slide, but to keep things simple, we work with data a lot and see what we can make sense of from that data, and organize that data in different ways to try and get better policy outcomes, particularly in the climate space. So if you go to the next slide, what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a bit about the climate program portal and just give you an overview, and then Jaclyn is going to get into some of the stories that we've seen on the tool, and at the same time, what she offers is a way, like shows you how to use the tool. So our hope is that you see some of the stories that we're seeing, but also that you feel confident enough after this to explore it and say you're interested in a particular program, in a particular funding source, in a particular state, in a particular kind of recipient, that you're able to pull your own stories out of the data after this. So if you go to the next slide. The climate program portal, we launched in early 2022, and we track the climate programs from EJA, so that's the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the Inflation Reduction Act. We have more than 2,300 users. The tool is free to use. A lot of the tool is open to any users, but we have a couple of dashboards that Jaclyn will walk through today, and they're only open to public officials, advocates, and NGOs. So if you go to the next slide. The two that Jaclyn will do a better job of explaining today are the opportunities dashboard and the outcomes dashboard. We wanted to put them side by side just to try and make things a little easier to understand. But the opportunities dashboard basically outlines the opportunity in the funding, including to break down all the funding from the two laws, so that you can explore the funding and see what funding works for you or for those you're working with. And then as part of that tool, there are requests and deadlines that Jaclyn will show you a bit more of. And then the outcomes dashboard that Jaclyn will get into more is a way of us saying, okay, once the funding is awarded, what are we seeing in the data? What are we learning from where the funding is going? What kind of projects it is funding? So if you go to the next slide. On the climate program portal, we track $664 billion in climate funding. And you can see that a big chunk of that, it goes through Treasury, so tax credits. But there's a really significant amount of funding that goes through other agencies where we have much better data on what's going on. And so you can find a lot more about that on the climate program portal. And as part of that, we track 178 new programs and then 115 existing programs. So if you go to the next slide. Jaclyn will show you a bit more about this, but we track 570, we've tracked 570 requests that agencies have put out. And so they range from NOI through RFPs. And then we also track deadlines. So in the legislation, there were deadlines written in for agencies to take one action or another. And so we track those deadlines so that you can see what is coming up and what you should plan for over the next couple of months. And so if you go to the next slide. I think this is my last one before Jaclyn jumps in, but it's worth noting that we have both these tools, but then a bunch of other tools on the climate program portal. And so to give you encourage you to have a look through the climate program portal that I put in the chat, and encourage you to if you see events or resources we're not featuring, to get in touch with us. There's a bunch of places on the website that where you can get in touch. But we have a library, so we compile reports about and other resources about what implementation looks like, and you can sort through all that information. We have an events calendar about important upcoming events for input or to learn more about parts of the legislation. We have a technical assistance directory, and that's getting a bit of a renovation at the moment. And so over the next couple of months, we will relaunch that. And that's all free interactive technical assistance to help with implementation. We put out weekly summary digests, and so Jaclyn does a ton of work during the week to keep track of what funding, what opportunities are open, what things are moving, and then she pulls it all into a digest that goes out every Wednesday. And so I really encourage you to keep an eye out for that. We have a media pulse where we track stories related to the legislation. We produce spotlights and issue briefs, so analysis to try and unpack some of the funding. We have a monthly call, so it is similar to this one, but smaller, a bit more intimate, and we dig into a different policy area each month. And then the last one I'll flag is that we just launched the Wetlands Impact Tracker that you can find on the dashboard. Encourage you to have a look around. This tool is exciting because we track in the Gulf region the build out of developments as assessed by the Army Corps of Engineers. And as part of that, you're able to see where developments are happening that are impacting wetlands or important waterways. And you can see, particularly from a climate perspective, where there's oil and gas developments in the region. And that tool we developed using AI to scrape a ton of Army Corps of Engineer PDFs. So yeah, encourage you to check it out. But I think that's my part done. I will pass over to Jaclyn, who will walk through the tool a bit more.
Great. Thanks, Tom, for that overview. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now to show you our dashboards. All right, can everyone see this page? Awesome. All right, so as you know, with so many funding opportunities and awards being announced each week, it can be hard to keep track of all of them. So what we've done is compile all that data into one place so you can easily track the implementation of these programs and see where the funding is going and who it's going to. So we track that in two parts. The first is the opportunities dashboard, which is what I have pulled up here. This helps you access the funding and understand the funding. Then we have the outcomes dashboard, which shows you what's happening with the funding. And I'm going to spend more time on the outcomes dashboard, but just want to highlight what's here on the opportunities dashboard so you can see what funding opportunities are available to you. So if I scroll down here, you can see we have a total of 53 RFPs and 3 public comments that are due in 2024. We have a number of upcoming ones, including 2 that are due today, as well as tomorrow, the Clean School Bus Rebate Program, which is really important too. And we also have, if you scroll down here, implementation deadlines, which are taken directly from the text of the 2 laws. And you can see that we have 17 upcoming ones due in 2024. These include things like grant solicitations, reports, program establishments, and much more. And if you want to break that data down even further and look at a specific program or eligible applicant type, you can use these filters at the top, as well as this yellow filter bar at the right, and you can filter it that way to make it easier to search. But now I'm going to head over to the outcomes dashboard. So before I dive in, there's one part on here that I will note. We call these climate elements, and it's important to note that we use our own classification. That's not necessarily, it may not necessarily agree with like agency classification. So it's kind of our way of noting if there's any consideration of key climate elements in the programs or the project's description. But we encourage you to, in your own analysis, look further into the project, and also note that we assign multiple climate elements to a single project. So for example, if a project will deploy electric vehicles, but also add bike lanes or pedestrian crosswalks, then that would be tagged in things like electrification and active transportation. But of course, we can't go into every single program that's been awarded so far. As you can see, 77 billion across 91 programs and over 6,900 projects. That's a lot, but we are going to spotlight 3 key programs today and tell you about some of the stories that we've seen based on the data that's been made available. So if you want to look at specific program data, that's where this yellow filter bar is really comes in handy. And as you dig into the data, you can see like awards made to each state, who received it, that sort of thing. So lots of ways to slice and dice the data. But I'm going to start with the first program, which is the Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, also called the RAISE program, which actually... So the RAISE program, nearly $5 billion has been awarded for 328 projects. And on this map, you can see which states received a lot of funding. So for this program, there's a good spread across states, but a really impressive story for California and Washington, who received the largest amount of funding at $241 million and $226 million, respectively. We also have a lot of money going to Texas, so that's also important to note. And that's a total view. But if you look at per capita, you see that changes a bit. So now the states that have the most funding here would be Alaska, Montana, North Vermont. And going over here to the climate elements, you can see that a lot of projects through this program are receiving funding through active transportation at almost $2.8 billion. And if you scroll down, you can see the full list of projects for this program. And I'll also note in 2023, really important milestone, we saw a record raise funding for bicycle and pedestrian projects. 6 of the states that were awarded received $25 million, the largest of all bike and pedestrian projects. And we dove more into that in our spot. Tom can include a link of. And one of those cities, for example, the city of Indianapolis received $25 million to convert 4 pairs of one-way streets into 2-way streets using a complete streets approach that will include the addition of bike lanes, multi-use paths, and sidewalk improvements. But scrolling back to the top, you can also see we have a funding breakdown. So this shows you, sorry, go back here. Yeah, so this funding breakdown shows you that we still have 60% of the funding that's been awarded, but there's still like 40% of it available. And also the fiscal year 2024 raise applications are currently open, and those applications are due at the end of the month. So keep an eye out for those. The next program I want to spotlight is the Clean School Bus program. So I'm just going to reset this. And I will just search for it through this way. But you can also use that scroll button at the bottom. So for this program, the EPA has allocated $5 billion to 2 programs within this one program. So there's a grant program where applicants are awarded funds to purchase buses, applicants to receive awards before purchasing eligible buses that replace existing school buses with clean and zero emission models. So important to note, in fall 2023, the EPA opened the 2023 Clean School Bus Rebates Program, and we expect to see those awards come out later this year. There's at least $500 million in funding under that program, and applications are due tomorrow. So as you can see here, so far nearly $2 billion has been awarded for 452 projects. And looking at this map, you can see that Illinois takes the lead with the largest amount of funding. But again, looking at per capita view, you can see that changes, and Louisiana takes lead with that. So some important notes on the projects. So you can see, again, a list of projects down here that have all been awarded so far. One thing we do measure as well is the outcome metrics. So where available, we track estimated outcomes from projects to measure the impacts of the project. So for this program, it's a really great example of that because we track the vehicles committed. So you can see state how many vehicles will be going to each state through this program. And I'll also note that our number is a little bit different from what's published on the EPA site because we take a large portion of our data collection is from the map of progress. So the numbers may vary a bit differently, but like pretty much all the projects are on here. So if you want to learn more about those, there are links at the bottom of this page. So you can just click on that and it'll take you directly to the program page to learn more about it. And then last program that I want to spotlight is the Orphan Wells program, also called Orphan Well Site Plugging Remediation and Restoration. For this program, currently our dashboard is updating. So this total is actually a lot bigger, and so is the projects, but that will be updated later today. For this program, the IIJA authorizes $4.7 billion to plug, remediate, reclaim orphan wells on federal, tribal, and state lands. And currently there's over 600 million in funding awarded for 53 projects. And this 3 awards means there's like 3 programs awarded within 1 program. So again, the federal, tribal, and state. And then if you look at the map again, you can see across the states, Oklahoma received the largest funding awarded at about $56 million for 6 projects. But per capita, that looks a bit different. So that will change to Wyoming. And if you want to dig into that data a bit more and see like exactly who received the funding, you can also filter that out. I will note that I'll use this yellow filter bar, for example. But if you want to look at a specific state, for example, like let's go back to Oklahoma, which received the most. Oops, sorry. Here. And then under recipient category, let's say I'm interested in who received the most. You can see that tribal governments here received the most for this round, so 29.5 million. And there's lots of ways to slice and dice the data, as I mentioned before, so you can filter it as however you want. And if you scroll down, you can see the each of the projects for that. So the tribal governments, these are all the recipients that have been awarded. But yeah, so that is kind of an overview of our outcomes dashboard. And again, lots of programs on here, so we encourage you to explore that and see what's been awarded so far. But with that, I will pass it back to Tom to close us out.
I think my closeout is very straightforward, but it's if we pull up the slides again, basically we are offering our contact information, and I will put that in the chat as well, in case you have any follow-up questions or want to get in touch. So if you go forward 2 slides. Yes. And encourage you to register, to have a poke around, to get in touch. And also if you have any questions now, I see some in the chat that I'm going to try and respond to as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We can go ahead and stop screen sharing at this point. And we'll just move into Q&A. But thank you so much, all 3 of you. Those were extremely informative presentations and really great for a kind of high-level review of what's going on in the states right now. We have a couple questions in the chat. And one is specifically for Atlas, but thinking about maybe you don't have time to go into the formula programs, but do you track state energy rebates?
Jaclyn, do you know about this one?
You're muted.
The state energy rebates, I believe, yes, we do. But currently those programs are still underway, so we'll update that as they come in.
Okay, great. Another question, kind of zooming out now, maybe what are some major differences in priorities between previous years and this year? You know, like what are some new policies or approaches or a shift in focus that is really, any of the panelists think are, you know, will be big ticket items this year in legislatures or via regulations as well?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time? Because I was reading questions in the chat.
Sure, no worries. What are some major differences and priorities between previous years and this year? Are there new policies or approaches we haven't seen before, or major like trends for this year that are going to be big ticket items?
Yeah, I'll just say I think the past couple of years have been very IRA focused, and I think still seeing some of that, but I think states are trying to look beyond and like what's coming next a little bit more this year. And I think that kind of transmission is that like next piece of the puzzle. I'll also say that so this year generally are short sessions for states. And so I know that there are already some states that I have talking to us about, okay, well, we can't really do very much in our 30-day session that we have here. So what can we look forward to 2025 to pass something really big on, say, transportation, or a really big permitting bill or something like that? There have been conversations there. So I think I'm seeing the trend more this year of what can we get done a little bit more piecemeal or smaller scale things, and that, which not across the board, there's some really great and exciting things, of course. But I think that there are some states really already looking ahead to that 2025 session.
I will like add quickly that I think as part of our tracking, which does something different, so to look at the funding, there's a lot more of the Inflation Reduction Act programs that are coming into maturity this year, and so a ton more of that funding will go out, and tax credits are a big part of that, and we have guidance now on tax credits, and they're operational and whatever else. So I think that's really significant. And then I think there's obviously a like electoral imperative at the end of the year. I think there's going to be a lot of storytelling about what the legislation has or hasn't done. And so our hope is that that storytelling is informed by good data on where we're seeing funding flowing, as opposed to sort of political talking points only. But I think that means there'll be a lot of attention on the legacy of this legislation already, and there'll be a lot of attention on particular states and what funding has hit the ground in those states.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question on a specific type of legislation that wasn't really mentioned today, but efforts around state pension boards and assessing the climate risk of pension holdings. I think, yeah, last year was a big year for anti-ESG pushing as well. But yeah, Ava, if you want to maybe speak to anything you know about that state pension boards question.
Yes, so I was putting in the chat. So we did a webinar on this at the beginning of January on climate finance in the states, and it was really great at covering both the kind of defensive work around anti-ESG legislation, and also looking proactively at some of the work that states have done to more positively incorporate climate risk into their pension planning. So I encourage you to check that out. We're also going to be coming out with a climate finance briefing book for state legislators, so stay tuned for that. But and maybe we can put this in the chat. Take me a second to find it, but Pleiades, I would never know how to say their name, Pleiades Strategy. They have a great tracker of all of the anti-ESG bills that's publicly available for this session and in past sessions. So that's a really good way to track the defensive work. And we're working together to put some bill tracking on the more pro legislation as well. So stay tuned there, but I think that recap article and webinar would be a good place to start. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Sidra.
Great, thank you so much. Pleiades Strategy, I believe, is very doing a lot of work in this space. We have a couple more minutes left here for the climate program portal folks. Questions on a little bit about the work that goes into tracking the IRA and EJF funding for your dashboard, and where you get your data sources, where your data sources are.
Yeah, so I just put in the chat. So we generally get these from federal and state agency funding announcements, press releases, We also subscribe to like all the programs newsletters. So anytime there's an update, we make sure to keep note of that, and we put that into our database, and then that updates on the climate program portal. So our data is updated very frequently. So anytime something new is announced, like an award or a funding opportunity, that'll be up there.
Great, thank you. And I also do want to highlight, they didn't get into the technical assistance directory, but the climate program portal's technical assistance directory is very helpful to kind of see a lot of the NGOs and resources and things that are being, as well as governmental programs that are around technical assistance for states, tribes, other sorts of jurisdictions. So very cool, thank you. And then the last thing I'll say is, you know, we here at Climate Exchange are always into deduplication and promoting other orgs and tools that are also doing this work. There was a question in the chat about national NGOs kind of promoting, coordinating, and supporting some of the legislative initiatives that Ava was talking about, including lobbying to expedite their adoption. So I don't know if any of you folks have a plug for other NGOs that are working kind of cross climate and clean energy work that are also including lobbying to kind of expedite the adoption of those policies. The answer can be, I don't know.
Very broad. There's a lot of different organizations for a lot of different topics that I mentioned. I'll, instead of just naming orgs, because there's just too many, and all the resources we linked, we always have kind of a link to other resources from other groups, and so can give a stamp of approval to any organization on our resources.
Great, thank you so much. I think we got through a lot of the things that folks were asking, trying to track those questions in the chat as well. And I will just start wrapping up by saying the recording, actually before I say that, we have a question, should we tell our state senators and assembly members about this portal? Tom and Jaclyn, I think the answer is yes, but I will let you.
I like that question.
Yes, very open to government and NGO use alike. But yeah, okay. So we will wrap up. Thank you so much for coming. The recording, transcription, and recap article where we summarize these presentations will be emailed to you by the end of the week. It'll also be posted on our website alongside all of our other recaps and every other webinar we've hosted. This is an annual webinar that we're doing every February to kind of go over what's happening in 2024. Thanks a lot for taking a busy hour out of your schedules to come and chat with us. And you can feel free to reach out to me at Kristen@climate-exchange.org if you have any questions about these tools, if you want to get in contact with any of the speakers, if you want to learn more about the other events that we host. And then the last thing is I will plug, we do these webinars every month, but we also do at the end of every month a State Climate Policy Network update call where 4 to 7 states will give updates on what has been happening in their state's climate policy in the past few months. So yeah, thank you all. It's great to see everyone and keep fighting the good fight, especially as we're going into elections. I know it's a crazy hectic time for everybody. And yeah, keep doing amazing work. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but have a great rest of your day, everyone. And yes, all we will include links and things in the recording and chat. Bye-bye.